Well, good morning or afternoon to all of you who joined us today. Thanks for being here for this, what I think is going to be a really great webinar. My name is Tom Fuller. My day job is the Communications Manager for the Oregon Department of Transportation out on the West Coast, where it is just 10 o'clock in the morning, just getting started. We're going to spend the next hour together for Brenda to talk to us about strategic communications planning. And a couple of housekeeping things as we begin here this morning. You can adjust your audio with the audio settings at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions, and this one's really important, you can submit them by clicking the Q&A button, and it'll either be at the top or the bottom of your screen. And we'd love to get your questions and see if we can stump Brenda on strategic communications planning. And a little bit about NAGC. So I'm on the board of NAGC, and I'm the Professional Development Director. So that's where we're trying to up our game, trying to get more knowledgeable. And this is one of the key areas where I think we can increase our knowledge as professional communicators. And really that's what NAGC is all about. We are here to advocate for, promote, and recognize excellence in government communications. And one of the key components of what we do is to provide opportunities like this for professional development, for career enhancement, enhancing effective communications with our constituents, and really advancing the profession of government communication. We're not just a bunch of folks throwing tactics out there. We really want to be more strategic because we show more value to our organizations for communications and public relations work, and we also do better work for our constituents the more effective our communications are. The membership to NAGC is open to anybody performing communication duties within a government entity, whether you're a public information officer, a speechwriter, webmaster, social media expert, or anything like that. And we really try to provide world-class training opportunities for our members, and also if you're with us and you're a non-member, you can attend our communication school, which is in Louisville this year, this coming May. And also you can put in for the Blue Pencil and Gold Screen Awards, which is a highly recognized and very valuable award. We here at the Oregon Department of Transportation were really honored a few years ago to win a Best in Show award from the Blue Pencil and Gold Screen Awards for a campaign that we did on road usage taxes. So anyway, with that, I wanted to introduce Brenda to you. And we've just been nerding away here prior to the beginning of the webinar about strategic communication planning. And she has spent her whole career in public relations, really chipping away, she says, at the barriers to health and happiness for people and the planet. What a great goal in life. She really has 20 years of experience directing strategic communication plans. She's worked for nonprofits and governments and universities and foundations. She's a senior vice president at Vanguard Communications, which is really one of our nation's first cause-focused communications firms. And she's had a bunch of successful national campaigns, which I'm sure she'll mention some of those to you, but they include creating a permanently protected national monument, changing the conversation in our nation about the family, food from the family farm, and increasing understanding acceptance of mental health issues, which is really vital in our society today. She was named a 2019 PR News Top Woman in PR for her far-reaching impact in the field of strategic and communications and public relations. She's a member of the faculty at American University's School of Communication. I'd like to thank you, Brenda, for taking the time to help us out with strategic communication planning. I'm going to turn this back over to you to begin your presentation, and then we will have time for questions afterwards. So I'm looking here now, and it sounds like Brenda got her off of the webinar. Here she comes back on again. We may be having some communication issues, some technology issues. So Brenda's back with us, and she's going to share her screen. I will tell you while we're waiting for Brenda to get back connected, as soon as I see her PowerPoint show up, I'm going to turn this back over to her. But I wanted to let you know that we do have other webinars that are coming up. Next month, for instance, we are going to have a webinar with Casey Mank, and the title is Hacking the Interwebs with Great Writing. If you have ever tried to take what is technical writing from a government organization and translate that into something that people on the web will understand, you know that challenge can be really great. And Casey's going to help us through that. So that's coming up on January 15th. Now it looks like Brenda's up, so I'm going to turn it over to her. Take it away, Brenda.
Hi, everybody. So sorry for those technical difficulties. They can only happen during times like this. So I apologize for the perfect timing. So I am Brenda Foster, and I'm Senior Vice President at Vanguard Communications in Washington, D.C. And I'm really excited to be here today. I have about a little over 20 years of experience in social and behavior change. And one of the major areas where I do this is for federal, state, and local governments. So before we get started, know that I do understand a lot of the budget and approval challenges that you go through at all of those levels of government. And I'm excited about this because as we go through this process, I hope you'll see some fail-safes that are built in that help to get over a lot of the hurdles that we experience when we're communicating through either doing a campaign within a government organization or pushing it outside of one. I also want to say that we're going to cover a lot today about process. There's so much to cover that I won't be able to get in deep into every single step, and I know you'll have a ton of questions about that. I'll try to answer them as I go. But also know that this screen right here is here because if you have any other questions or you want something you want to talk over about part of your process or an issue that you've experienced, please feel free to email me. I can't promise that I'll get back to you right away, but I will get back to you and try to help you as best I can. So let me get started by talking about what we're going to cover today. Okay, here we go. So the learning objectives today, I always like to start with learning objectives, and you'll see why objectives are so important to me a little bit further into our presentation. The first is that we want to make sure that we understand and articulate the benefits of the strategic communications planning process to organizations. And this is particularly focused on governmental organizations, but I know there are some of you who aren't specifically working for government, and that's okay too. This will all apply to you as well. Then I want you to be able to recognize the steps to completing the strategic communications plan. And then finally, I hope you'll be able to gain the confidence in guiding your organization to complete a strategic communications plan. That doesn't mean that you'll be able to do every step and every piece without some kind of help, but at least you'll have a sense of what do I need to do to get this started. So that is our hope for today. Okay. So the first thing that I think is important is to define what we mean by strategic communication, because strategy doesn't always mean that it's strategic communication. So when we think about strategic communication, we're talking about communication that is based on research. And it doesn't have to be, don't let research be scary. Research can be asking 3 family members. Now, that's not the best research, but it is if those are your audience, right? So if the 3 family members, you're trying to decide what to do for Christmas Eve dinner, then that is the very best research you can do to ask them. Just guessing about what they want to do for Christmas Eve dinner, I would suppose that you're going to end up with 1 or 2 people who disagree with you or who have other ideas. And so that's the idea of being strategic. It's also about organizing your strategies into a master plan rather than doing strategies piecemeal without knowing how they all fit together. It's about centering what you say and what you do around specific activities. It's about basing all of your activities on a goal and measurable objectives, and then choosing tactics that result in measurable outcomes. So I like to say that this is the opposite of seat of the pants communication. So one of the things that we were talking about before everybody came on, Tom and I, was how much of when you're being strategic, it's almost confirming your hunches. 90% of the time when you do this process, you're doing it to confirm your hunches. But that 10% of the time, you were totally wrong and it tells you you were wrong. That 10% is a very expensive 10%. If you make a mistake, either it can cause you to not have the trust of the organization that you're working with again, to lose money, or to even have terrible consequences that actually went opposite of what you wanted. So here's why it's important. And there's some barriers here that I know we deal with in government communication that I hope this will help you to get over. So the first thing is when you're doing strategic communications planning, it saves money. because you're only investing in projects that make sense to reach your goals. It's like you're coming up with a filter or an umbrella that everything has to go through in order for money and resources to be spent on it. So some less than strategic ideas may come up, and if you have a plan, you can test it against the plan and say, does this work with what we're trying to do, or does it not? It helps to keep focus and build momentum toward objectives and goals. You don't just have a bunch of pet programs that are taking away resources that you could use more strategically. It provides organization. So if you have a department or a set of consultants that you're working with, it really helps you figure out, oh, this one has this strength, so they can do this piece, and it sorts out responsibilities and deadlines. It absolutely helps with funding. Having a sound plan based on research is the thing that funders love the most, whether it is your internal budget managers, it could be foundations. Ultimately, it's the taxpayers, because if you can show them that you did everything you needed to do, you have a better chance of getting their support. I'll take politics out of that, because always politics play a role, but having that basis of research that you based your communication spending on, it will make a big difference. It proves success. We're going to talk about how from the very beginning you're setting yourself up to be able to evaluate and to show whether the investment of time and resources made sense. It supports the organizational goals. So communications plan is always based on the goals of the organization even before you set those communications goals. So again, it makes sure that you're actually supporting what the organization wants to get done. It strengthens your brand. It streamlines communications to those elements that most support the brand that you've established. It reduces micromanagement, because if you're able to offer a strategic roadmap going forward, then it's easy for people to see what you're doing next. So if you set it out and you say every month here are the milestones we're going to reach, then it's really easy for people to see, oh yeah, that's what they're working on. And finally, it coordinates messages so that you figured out what is most effective to say about whatever the issue is that you're promoting, and everyone says it. Everybody gets on the same page. So a strategic communications plan, for a really long time, we looked at these as 20 to 40 page written documents. They were often in a binder or some other thing that ended up on a shelf. And the way that we like to look at it is we want you to put it in the format you will use. So consider yourself the first audience, you or your organization. And the fact is, if most of your organization, after you've figured out what you want the plan to be, if most of them will respond best to a one-pager, well, we have an example here of a communications plan that we condensed into a one-page. That way, everybody's got it. It's easy to take a look at. One of the most popular ways and common ways that we will do a communications plan is in a PowerPoint. We do that because it allows you to get down to just bullets, and you don't have to write a lot of paragraphs, which can take a long time and be a lot for people to read and digest. It also makes it very easy when people want to know what you're doing to just put it up and do a presentation. So that is our that's our recommendation. That's our most common tactic. The other thing I will say is there's nothing wrong with doing that 20 to 40 page research paper, but you just have to know it's going to be used. And you have to understand, okay, well, the audience who's going to approve this for me really doesn't approve anything that isn't in that format. That's fine. You just need to know, okay, is that all you need? Or maybe you also need to condense it into one of these other formats as well. Okay, so what we're going to get into now are the steps to developing a strategic communications plan. And I'm going to give you all of these steps now, and then we'll go over them one by one. And I'll try to give you as many examples as I can while still hitting in the time limit that we have today. So the first thing is you're going to do a situational analysis. And that is really gathering internal and external information about the problem that you're trying to solve with communications. It's going through research and doing a lot of other things, but that's the first thing that you do. Then once you look at all that, you say, here's the problem I'm trying to solve, and it feels like this is the way to solve it, meaning this is the goal that I have. I need to do this in order to solve that problem. All right, and that's a communication goal. Then you come up with measurable objectives. So a lot of people think goals and objectives are synonyms. They are not. So a goal is more broad, and objectives are the steps that show that you're making progress toward that goal. Then you will identify and segment priority audiences. We usually say 1 to 3 for a 3-year plan. I love it when you have one audience, but sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes you need to do 2 or 3. The reason I say it is because even if you put 6 audiences down, what you're doing is spreading your resources way too thin, and you're not going to really be effective to any of them. So if you're not going to be effective anyhow, you're better off being really effective with 1 to 3 than you are being ineffective with all of your audiences. Then you'll develop messages for each audience. Now, we consider these message concepts because we're not talking about slogans. We're talking about what are the phrases or the words or the concepts that you need to say in order to get your audience to think, feel, or act on the subject. Then we'll pre-test, and we'll talk a little bit about the benefits of pre-testing. Then the plan most people have starts here: channels, activities, materials, and partnerships. This is the stuff, right? This is the thing that people will come to you and say, hey, I think we ought to do, let's open a social media account. Let's do a billboard. Let's do this. Let's do that. That's usually where people start. And look at this. We're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps down. So after you've got all this information, you will likely pick channels, activities, materials, and partnerships that are way different than you might have picked just by flying by the seat of your pants. Then we talk about implementation. Again, that's a whole big thing, but really it's just figuring out what's the realistic timeline. What's the staffing that I need? Do I have it? Can I get it? And then what are the resources that I need? And then evaluation. Now, that is not the last step because you will start talking about evaluation from the very beginning, but it is important to do that to measure and reassess whether or not the things that you've decided as you start are correct. And then you'll get back at least annually and say, oh yeah, that part didn't work. Let's cut that out and try something else. All right, that's mid-course correction. So let's start with situational analysis. Let me see, I have a question here. Let me just check and see. Oh yeah, okay, so when we get to pre-testing, great question on pre-testing. When we get to that, I will definitely, I'll hit on that, Kate. Okay, so the situational analysis, so these are the questions that you want to ask. And if it's just a matter of like, write them down on a piece of paper, write them down, type them out on your computer. I'm sorry, I'm very old school. So type them out on your computer and see where you can get the information. Is it a literature review? And when I say literature review, I'm not trying to be too academic. I'm saying, are there journal articles or a Google search that can give you enough background? Sometimes, I know this sounds crazy, but sometimes I'll go to Wikipedia and go to the sources at the bottom so that it's a kind of a shortcut to find your first research, pieces of original research. And then who cares about it? That's really important because this is going to help you eventually figure out who your audiences need to be, or maybe who your messengers need to be. So you need to identify those people. What are the barriers to solving the problem? If there weren't barriers, you'd already have, excuse me. Anyhow, what are the barriers to solving the problem? If there weren't barriers, you'd have already solved it by now. And who is already involved? Who's doing this already? Who might be doing a version of it? Who's tried but failed? And then who should be involved? Who's missing from the scenario and should be involved in any kind of a campaign? What do people think about the problem? What are some of the prevailing myths or ideas that they have about the problem? And then does the media know about the problem? Do they have any idea at all? All of these things, once you have this picture, filling out the rest of the plan becomes much easier. Now, sometimes this will involve, we call them focus groups. I would say in government, particularly federal government, you have an awful lot of hoops to go through to do formal research. So depending, you may want to do discussion groups, or if you have, say, a nonprofit partner that you work with, they may be able to do them for you so that you can get the information. So you can do this kind of research pretty informally. We're not so much looking for, can it pass? Can it be submitted to a journal? It's more, did I get the information that I needed? Okay, so this goal that you're going to set, please only set one. Lots of people set 3, but again, you're really trying to come up with a lofty but doable goal that's not easy to measure. That probably doesn't, we've heard of SMART goals, we've heard of SMART objectives. I'm here to say to you, if you worry so much about the S, M, A, R, and T of SMART, you're probably not going to be able to get something that you can actually do. So there's nothing wrong with those things, but you might not be able to hit all of them. And on goals, you really don't want to be that as specific, because that's something that you want, that's the end. And you may do 3 rounds of a communications plan before you see that you've actually reached that goal and want to change the goal. So an example that we'll work through here and then on the objectives is position the Ohio Veterans Administration as the leading resource for health information for past and present service members. So the idea is, maybe we found out that, you know, you have all of these services available to service members in the Idaho Veterans Administration, but they're not using them. People aren't going to your website. Maybe people are screaming that there aren't enough resources and they aren't finding yours. So those are kinds of things that you might have found in your situational analysis, that there are issues, that they don't realize that you have all of this information. So that would be your goal. All right. So then you take a look and you say, how will I know I'm even getting close to that goal? So what you want to do with your objectives is make them as measurable as possible. So increase awareness of Idaho Veterans Administration Health Services is a great objective. What that means is, it isn't that I'm trying to convince you they're the best yet. I just want you to know they exist. All right. So this is very basic. Then the second thing is, I need people to know that these are actually effective resources. So A, it's kind of like, I have resources on my site, is your first objective. Your second would be, and they work. And then C is, not only do I know that they work, but you're telling me that they work and you're telling other people. So you can't do number 3 before you've done number 1 and number 2. So the idea would be, okay, and you can measure these things. So increase awareness. This could be how many people are following Twitter. This is your social media campaigns. This is how many people have checked out your website. How many people have maybe called a hotline that you set up or something like that. The second one, you would measure more by saying, you know, you want to find out people, how people are using them. You might talk to the actual referrals on your service member resource site. You might want to ask them to do a survey after they have used the resources. So that gets a little deeper into evaluation, but you know you can measure it. And then finally, same thing. Once they've used the services, then you can do some focus groups or follow-up phone calls or anecdotal information that your providers are getting from the veterans. The way I like to look at this when you think about objectives is you look at the 3 A's. You're really looking at objectives that increase awareness, that increase acceptance, and increase action. All right. And those are in the order that you would do it, because action cannot come before people know about what's going on. So those are the areas that you would take a look at. All right. And I am watching for questions if you need me to slow down a bit. Okay. So now you're going to try to figure out who your audience is. And you're going to have a lot of ideas. But what you really want to know is, first, who is affected? Who cares? Who do they listen to? And then these might not be the same people. Whose knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors should change? So I think about, for example, maybe children and youth are affected, but the fact is that they're not going to take any, they're not going to, take any action if their parents' knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors around that particular subject are against the messaging that is important to do the behavior change. So sometimes you have to educate the parents first, even though the people who are affected are the kids. And then also, who is most likely to change? We use that low-hanging fruit phrase a lot here, because sometimes your list of audiences is 10 or 12 different groups of people. You can't do them all. Who do you want to do first? Well, just like anything else, they always say when you're paying off credit or bills, you start with the smallest bill first. Same thing with audiences. Start with the one that's easy to change because they're more likely to help you grow that momentum. And also, it shows success earlier so that you can continue to get funding and support. Okay, so, oops, rolled it back. So one of the things to think about, there is the stages of change is from researchers Prochaska and DiClemente. And basically it talks about how people move through changing their behavior. And so, how people move through changing their behavior. So they start out, a lot of people, they might start somewhere on this continuum. So they might be interested in something, and then you only have to move them from interest to a desire to learn more, right? But they might start with no awareness at all, and you have to get them all the way through these 5 steps in order to really see behavior change. So that's where that low-hanging fruit comes in, because if you know that you have a group that have a desire to learn more, sometimes starting with them is your best bet. At the same time, sometimes the most affected group, the people who are hurting the most, are the people with no awareness, and you have to invest there, because otherwise, if you wait to invest there, many more people will be hurt or affected. All right. So then, it isn't just about, a lot of people like to say our audience is moms, or we'll get even more specific and say soccer moms, right? The fact is that I can sit in a room with 20 moms and we will all have 20 different opinions. So you want to try to get this down to A, a group of people you can afford to go after, and B, people who are very, very specific. So it isn't just about mothers, it is what age are they, right? Do you want mothers of little kids or mothers of teenagers? Do you want mothers of grown children? What are their ages, right? Are you more likely to get impact or awareness from mothers who are 18 to 24 than you are, say, mothers who are in their 40s and 50s? Where do they live and work? Is it in a city? Is it in the country? Is it a specific location? So I'm in DC. Would it be all of District Maryland and Virginia, or do we want to pinpoint one community where we think we can make the most difference? Are they comfortable with technology? That's a really important thing, right? Because if they're not, then I'm guessing a lot of the technology solutions that we tend to jump to are not going to work for them. And then finally, what's their race and ethnicity? What's their culture? And this is just an example. There are many, many more things. I like to say that when you are thinking about how to do this, you want to think about getting to know your audience as though you were going to buy a gift. So even if you're not going to use this information, thinking about it will help you come up with really creative ideas. So you want to be as specific as possible. Think about the type of car that they drive, their favorite sports team, their education level, what kind of transportation do they take, right? Bus posters don't just come out of nowhere. Sometimes when people do political campaigns, for example, they do just signs on 2 corners that they think make the most sense for the people that they want to turn. So as specific as you can get, that's the best way to really target your audience. Another thing you want to think about is barriers and benefits, okay? So how does the audience benefit if it supports your issue? Meaning, if you do this thing, if you buckle your seatbelt, you will live longer. You'll be around for your kids. Those are great benefits. But it could be something simpler, like you'll get more time, more money. And then what are the barriers? Culturally, we don't put our seatbelts on, or I'm sorry, I can't afford a car, let alone a car that has working seatbelts. I'm not that worried about it. I need to be able to be free to grab my kids if they're running around. There's all kinds of things that can get in the way. One of the things that I use as an example here sometimes is most everybody can think about Starbucks and whether or not you like it. Usually with groups, it's about half people who are Starbucks devotees and half are not. And the half that are, they're the benefits half, meaning that they will see that, well, they think it tastes good, or it's great for community, or They like how the company treats its employees. So those are the benefits people, the people who already like Starbucks. Then you've got your barriers people. Sometimes it is they don't like coffee. They don't like to sponsor corporations. So there's lots of different issues there. But Starbucks, when you think about it, thinks about what those barriers are and works to get over them, because Starbucks does. If I were Starbucks, I would say, you don't like coffee? Oh, we've got juice, we've got chocolate drinks, we've got different kinds of waters and teas. So that's what we're trying to do, is figure out, what can I say to you to get over those barriers? And speaking of saying, message development. That's really the reason you want to know those barriers and benefits, is because those will help you with message development. And again, I want to be clear on this step that it does not need to be a slogan. This is not where you worry about wordsmithing. This is where you worry about, how do I get over that barrier? It's like you're having an argument with yourself. You want your messages to be compelling and engaging and memorable. Oh, Kate, yes. Okay, so I just got Kate's great question. She says, audience is tough for us. We have folks who always say the general public, and that's not really helpful. So yeah, so everybody wants the general public. That is literally everyone. And probably the biggest place where the general public gets its information, okay, the most general public of communications tactics is the Super Bowl and Super Bowl ads, right? And even then, less than a quarter of the country is tuning in at any given time. So general public is literally impossible. You can't get anything out to the general public. We don't have 100% voting in this country. We don't have 100% compliance with anything. So what you have to sort of think about is, what I always do is I will give people an example of things that I like that they don't, to show that there's a difference between us, so that they can understand that, sure, you may be thinking about general public, but there are segments of that general public that we can't spend money on general public anyhow. It's so expensive. So if nothing else, to get over that barrier, you can talk about money. Yeah, it doesn't matter whether you want the general public. We have to start with a segment you can afford. So let's pick a part of the general public who is most likely to listen. All right, so let's see here. So then let's talk about pre-testing real quick. So pre-testing is incredibly important because it checks on our hunches. Remember what I said, we're right 90% of the time. This fixes that 10% where you're totally wrong. And I want to talk for a second about a really cool campaign. It was about 10 years ago that this was developed, and it was for the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense was having a lot of trouble with alcohol abuse from soldiers. And so they hired a consultant to help them figure out what would make the most sense. And so they went in thinking that the best thing to do is to appeal to their patriotism, right? You have a responsibility to the country. They used patriotic words. They used more military-looking graphics and things like that. And so they were convinced that this would work, because soldiers are really, you know, they're already working for patriotism. So why would they not? If you could just explain to them that they have a responsibility and a duty to not get drunk every time they go out on base or off, then that would work. So anyhow, they very smartly thought, well, let's just test this out. So they go and they test it out, and this is what they came up with. So take a look at this. It says, reason number 76 not to be that guy: toilet paper does not make a good pillow. So this is so not military-like, right? Girls don't think wetting the bed past age 5 is cute. What they figured out when they talked to the guys is the thing the thing that they responded to the most was that they didn't want to be that guy. They actually got the phrase from one of the guys in the focus group. They didn't want to be that guy that everybody always talks about and says, you're so embarrassing. And so suddenly they went from a very responsibility approach to an edgy, humorous, and way more relevant approach. And it went really, really well. They had, in all of the places that they implemented the campaign, they had better attendance at alcohol awareness seminars, and they had better compliance with the guidelines. If you take a look at thatguide.com now, it has evolved, but it still has that it has a lot of information that you might not expect on a website run by the Defense Department. Okay, so now we're going to talk about channels. So go back to the audience again. I would say when you're thinking about doing your plan, think about the audience in the middle of that plan, and all of the different pieces that you're coming up with. Those are the spokes of it, because you're going to keep going back. And so when you figured out who your audience was and who they find credible and where they're most likely to give attention, those are your channels. Now, channels are, how am I going to reach them? Not with what, okay, but how. So for example, we're talking about these kinds of things. There are usually 4 types of channels. You've got integrated media. That's where a lot of people go, is thinking about those social and earned media outlets. But we also have, we could be going after counselors and coaches and clergy and physicians. We have offices, churches, neighborhood associations, that kind of thing. So these are the channels that you want. Once you figure out these channels, then it becomes really easy to come up with the tactics. So I'll very quickly talk about an experience that I had. I was doing a training in Georgia at a hotel that had a very, very popular bar. So we take a break for a minute and we go down to the restroom, and coming out of the restroom of the bar, on the back of the door, it said, warning, women who are pregnant who consume alcohol may do damage to their unborn baby. And so you had to think about it for a second. Okay, how did that sign get back there? Well, so let's work it backwards. So if any women who are on right now have ever been pregnant, you may be aware that sometimes you spend some time in the restroom, a little bit. Now, what reason would you have to be hanging out in a bar unless you were thinking of drinking? So the idea was, okay, women are coming here to drink. This is a very popular spot. If they're pregnant, they're likely to go to the bathroom. And so hence, that's where that sign came in. But if you don't think about who your audience is, you would never have thought, oh, we better put a sign on the back of the bathroom. You might have put something at the bar, but the bathroom made a lot of sense. So that's how that all works. Okay. Okay. So when you're thinking about those activities, that sign on the back of the door, for example, you really want to think about, is it appropriate to the audience? Like, are you spending too much money, or are you using things that they wouldn't respond to? For instance, a lot of concerts, if you thought music was a great venue, a lot of concerts are going green now. So the idea of doing flyers or anything, like say you wanted a table at a music event, people don't really want flyers anymore. Most venues don't want those around because they just end up being litter. So you really have to think through how that might work. What's the environment or geography? Are you saying that you want to do a big broadcast campaign, but there's only one radio station in the area? So you really have to think about what you can actually access in order to choose something. Okay, so these are some examples. So what you want to do is you take your channels and then you figure out what are some things that I could do. So these are some pretty common ones, right? We do news conferences. I would say no, I know very few people who can pull off a in-person news conference, by the way. Usually we do those via webinar, just like this. We can do a parade, if that makes sense. We have tons of benefit races. Now, let me say something about the benefit races, just as an example. How many people, and it's hard for you to give me hands, but think about the fact how many times you've seen a benefit race or been asked to run in one. There's a lot of them. So one thing you want to think about with activities and materials is, am I throwing out just another benefit race, or can I do something that's slightly different to get the same result? Maybe I will do an annual scavenger hunt, or an annual tour of local kids hospitals or something like that, just so that you can make it more relevant and also make it different from the thousands of 5Ks that are out there. And I'm sorry I'm speeding through. It's a lot of steps to get through, and I also want to leave some time for questions. So another thing that people forget all the time is partnerships. So partnerships can do two things for you. They can extend your campaign reach and your budget. So again, we're going to go back to the audience, and you're going to look at 3 pieces of information. The first is, what partners share your goal, meaning they're right in it with you. And it could be a company that is working on that goal, or a nonprofit. It could be parents or teachers or some other group that cares about it. They might make great partners to help spread your message. Then you want to think about what partners represent your audience, because are there people out there who are working with your audience, and if you talk to them about what you're trying to do, might be like, hey, that sounds great. And then also, what partners reach your audience? So they actually have the same goal as you, but maybe they have a little more money, and if you got together, you would be able to extend your reach. So this is where, these are the 3 questions you want to ask when you're trying to figure out who can be in this with me. And, you know, sometimes it could be high profile individuals. You don't have to always think about organizations, because individuals can be partners as well. Okay. So implementation. I can't tell you how important it is to really sit down and think about this, because you may get to this step and have to go back and revise what you're thinking. Because if you do this the way that I'm suggesting, which is to list all of the activities you want to do, and then outline all of the steps to completion, and then assign a budget estimate. Now, don't forget, you've got expenses, you've got rental fees, you have all kinds of things. So you assign expenses, and then you also have to think about how many staff and hours you're going to need from those staff. Will it work with the people that you have? Or do you have to hire outside, or get volunteers, or hire lower cost interns or things like that? And then also assign a date for each step in the activity. This will help you with those situations where somebody says to you, it's January and I'd like to do a campaign in June. And when you do this activity, you'll be able to show them that if you do everything correctly, it's more likely that you'll have a campaign in November. So going through all of this, if you're trying to get approval, will help you figure out, do I need to go back? I picked 3 audiences. I better cut it down to 1 for this year, because I will never get this done with the resources that I have. So this is another area where, if you have objections at that bureaucratic level, this will help you get over them, or it will help you add some realism to a plan that somebody may have put out or suggested that probably isn't as realistic as they think. Okay, oops. Okay, evaluation. So we talked about, one of the ways that I like to do evaluation for the plan is you take the objectives and you lay them back down at the end of the plan and say, okay, here's specifically how I'm going to measure them. So this is an example. There are several kinds of what we call summative evaluation measures. One is process, that's kind of counting things. One is outcome measures, meaning here's what happened. And then impact is total, like everything that you wanted to change changed. Okay, so outcome is kind of like, oh, we're starting to see some people do some different things. Really, impact is we solved the problem, or we're on our way to solving the problem. So it's not bad to only have process measures when you start, because if you don't have those, then you'll never get to outcome or impact. So process measures on awareness would be stuff like, we got this many media hits. We gave out this many materials. We went to this many health fairs. Those are great measures. Those are still evaluation. And in the first year of a campaign, you were likely to only have process measures. Outcome measures, that can be, okay, we saw more people committing to things. We saw more people signing up. It might be, so when you think about social media and the difference between process and outcome, if you had a social media account and people were following you, that would be a process measure. But if they were writing you from, if they were messaging you back and saying, this sounds great, where can I get more information? Then that's a little bit of a, you're getting close to outcome, because now people are actually engaged and wanting to do something. So don't worry about evaluation. And if you set it up ahead of time underneath your objectives, then you're much more likely to have everybody on the same page about what success looks like. Okay, so finally, we get to mid-course corrections. So this is what I was saying, to not have your plan once you do it, sitting on a shelf or on your network. I would say do some kind of a monthly report. Even don't take too much time, because honestly, you don't want to use all your staff time on a report, but do enough that even if you list your measurements, you can say, okay, here's how we did this month. And then plan to meet quarterly. Sit down with the group that's working on it and really say, like, this piece is working, but this one isn't. Should we alter direction? Is there something new we can do? Is there feedback that we've gotten that will help us tighten up our messaging? And then finally, just make sure that all parties have a role in success. So if everybody has gotten together and agreed on this plan, it does make it way more real to everybody if they all have a role in implementing the plan. So if you have a set of stakeholders higher up in your governmental organization, make sure that you've involved them in events and coming to a focus group or discussion group or whatever you end up calling it. So those are the kinds of things that that you want to be looking at when you're trying to come back and say, did I do the right thing or not? So, okay. So now we're at questions, which I'm sure you have quite a few. So let me see. I do already have one from Mark. How do you measure awareness? It seems ephemeral. Media mentions and social media engagement and reach only tell you who saw the message, not what they thought about the message. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So this is one of the difficulties. That's why I said process measurements, right? Because process is more like, so I did it, but I can't prove anybody cared. That's why we'll go back to social media. When you see people engaging and sharing something, then you know you've at least gotten some awareness. There's a couple of ways to do it. One is really to take a look at sort of, we do what's called social listening. And sometimes there are tools out there to sort of take a look at what has the conversation turned to and how often does it involve the messages that you've been putting out there. Same with media. It isn't just about whether the media ran a story. It's about, are people sharing that story? Are you starting to see people inquiring or more hits to your website, which means that people had to take an action. And so that is, that's a way to measure awareness. Now, none of these are exact. Absolutely, you're right. Ephemeral is exactly the right word to use. But knowing that you have caused someone to do something other than pass you by is a way to measure awareness. The other way to do it is slightly more expensive, which is to do some sort of survey of a group of people. Sometimes, a lot of times we suggest that people do pilot projects so that maybe you pick one city that you're going to try to do the campaign you're working on, you just do it in one city. Because when you do that, suddenly the audience that you're trying to get to is smaller, and it's way easier to get feedback to see what works. So sometimes pilots can get you a little closer to that audience so you can figure out and measure a little bit better. Oh, the template. So I don't, I have what I have here is pretty close to the template that we have, but let me check, because if I have something like that, I will send it to Mackenzie. We have several that we've done for government work, and I just have to see if I have one that I can share. That would be lovely. We've talked about developing those for us, our clients before. Okay, what are your thoughts about how budget affects the messaging on the planning process? Okay, so if you can just, so what you mean is how, when you're, about how, are you talking about how budget affects whether or not you're able to do a plan, or how it affects the messaging section of the planning process? If someone can give me a little more clarification there. The first one, is that right? Okay, so this is, what I always say to people is, you are going to do audience research one way or the other. You can do it two ways. One, you can spend the time up front planning, doing the audience research and putting the right product out, or, and I'll use brochure even though that is an antiquated tool, you can put out a brochure that nobody likes or even hurts you, and you can end up with a closet full that you wasted money on and hurt your reputation. So I always, when I'm working with government organizations, I'll put that to them. Look, it's going to cost you to do this brochure that you're not sure about. It's going to cost you this amount of money. To do a plan, it's going to cost you about that same amount of money, and you may come up with something other than a brochure that makes sense or is cheaper. So in the end, this kind of planning really does help you save money. I hope that's helpful. Did I answer everybody? Let me see here. Anybody else have questions on any of the process or anything that I've talked about, or maybe something you wanted me to cover that I didn't?
Brenda, this is Tom. I'm going to jump in here and ask a question.
Sure.
How do we go about educating and advocating for good strategic communications to our bosses? So many times we get, oh, I want a video. You know, okay, do you want to have a couple of press releases and fries with that? You know, they jump right to what they want. But so what are your tips on advocating for good communication planning?
Hey, Brenda, it's Mackenzie. I think we lost your audio.
Oh, yes. Okay, you got me now?
Yeah,
You're back.
we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, so I meant to hit the volume button and I hit the, apparently you can't trust me on these webinars. I'm so sorry. Anyhow, so what I was saying to apparently myself is that when I first started doing consulting, the thing we would get most often is clients coming to us saying, we want to be on the front page of the New York Times. And sometimes that's just not necessary. Actually, 90% of the time, that's not necessary. Now, as things have evolved, we don't get that request very often anymore. But what we do get instead is, can you make me a viral video? And I always like to say, poof, you're a viral video. Anyhow, but viral videos, the reason we talk about them is because they are so rare, right? I can't tell you how many times people have told me they want, can we do something like the ice bucket challenge? I actually just had a call a couple days ago where the person was talking about a supervisor who said, so let's just figure out how to do the ice bucket challenge. Well, we can't. It's not possible. So what you really need to do is think about how much, it's a series of questions. So if I come to you and I say, we should just do one of those videos, they may be correct. That video, I mean, look, video is ubiquitous, and we encourage all of our clients to do as much photography and video as possible as part of their implementation. But then I think what you have to do is then ask questions like, so how do you see us using it? Oh, we would use it on Facebook. Well, who would we be targeting? What would you want them to do with the video? Do people understand our message enough to absorb it in a video? So you kind of have to go through the process with them of what would this video do? And then you kind of have to ask yourself, so is my audience even on Facebook, right? If you're going for Generation Z, for example, you might as well just, no way, Facebook makes no sense at all. TikTok is where you want to be. That would still be a video, but a very different video. So it is very difficult. People have their ideas, and I have found very often that new managers, new supervisors tend to be, you know, like a new CEO or a new department head. They tend to be most often be the ones that come in with, you know, we ought to be doing this cool new idea. And that's not wrong. It's just that you really have to think about whether or not it's going to work and work through that with them. All right, let's see. Do I have any case studies to share? Oh, so at the end of this, and Mackenzie is going to share the presentation with you. Let me show you. No, that was backwards. Really, guys, I'm so challenged. So there's some resources here that have actually quite a few really cool case studies. This tractor safety messages one I think is fascinating, as well as this message frames around plastic bag usage, about whether they called it a tax when they charge people 5 cents or whether they called it a fee. So there's some really good case studies in here because, and there's many, many more online. Sometimes organizations like PRSA and PR Week will have them, social marketing case studies, and if you have access to a research database, that will also give you some good case studies. Do you have internal communications resources? It's strategic government communications with a very specific audience. So it's really, when I look at internal communications, I kind of approach it the same way. Obviously, it's harder to get people, it's harder to do. I would love everybody to do a strategic communications plan for every goal that they have. I know that there's not as much support for spending that kind of time and resources on an internal plan, but you can still do a back of the envelope where you ask yourself those same questions and figure out, okay, what do these employees need, or the people on my team need, or the people who are making the decisions upstairs, what do they need? We do this a lot in our government communications, because the fact is that if you can't get it through the head of the department or the agency, then you're not going to get it done. So sometimes they're our first audience. So I often will go through the speeches that those agency heads have been doing and take a look at some of the phrases that they're using, or the things that are important to them, and then make those the arguments for why we need it, you know, fit my ideas underneath. But I do think that you can follow this very same process, again, back of the envelope if you have to, just to make sure that you thought it through to come up with whatever internal communications makes sense. For instance, one of the areas of internal communications that I feel is really, really overdone is newsletters. And we have tons of newsletters. We're getting them externally, we're getting them internally. And I know for me, maybe not all of you, but I know for me, I'm not reading them all. Sometimes they're too long. Sometimes I just don't have time. I'm not saving them for later. I just delete them. That's terrible, because think of how much of your life and your resources at work are going into making the newsletters. So it's really important to sort of figure out, is there something that they do, you know, are they spending a lot of time in the lunchroom, or can I get them in some other way? Can I come up with a private social channel, for example, to use? Oh. So let me see, any other questions? I know we've only got a couple minutes here.
Lisa says, thank you, Brenda.
Okay, good.
And
you're welcome.
and I wanted to thank you too. I'll put in a couple of plugs here, I guess, at the end. One is something that you and I, Brenda, talked about before the webinar. And as the professional development director, I think one of the best professional developments that we as government communicators can engage in is the accreditation in public relations through PRSA. I'm actually going through that myself, and I was telling you earlier, Brenda, that I was having a hard time getting through the book, because every page I would learn something and say, oh wait, I need to implement that now in my organization. So for our members that are out there, go to prsa.org. You can learn about that accreditation. It does take about a year to go through, but highly, highly valuable for your organization. And then the other thing that I would also plug again is sign up for our webinar in January about great writing for the web. February, we're going to go into detail about how to learn about who's saying what about you. And one of the steps Brenda didn't talk about here, but that you can do in a communication plan is a communications audit to find out kind of what's the messaging that's already out there about your organization or about your program, who's saying it, what are they saying, because that can really give you a leg up on how to message out there for the audiences that you're looking for. So that's coming in February. And then March, this is a cool one, but I'll warn you, we are not recording March's webinar. It will only be available live on your computer. And what we're going to do is talk about the evolving threat of disinformation and what you can do about it. Brenda, you were talking about viral videos. Sometimes those viral videos are about your organization. You didn't make them and you don't want them out there, sort of as part of disinformation that people do. We at the Department of Transportation have that happen to us on occasion. So Lisa Kaplan from the Althea Group is going to talk about tactics that we can use to help combat disinformation. So a couple of plugs up there for things that are coming up. But I do see, I know there's another question here. Brenda, if you've got a minute, we could try and answer this about metrics.
Oh, so what I was going to say, I was just writing back to the questioner, but just really quickly, there are so many different kinds of metrics, and a lot of times when I was in grad school, my evaluation professor said, really look at evaluation as a brainstorming exercise. There isn't one right way to measure, but sometimes you can come up with creative ways to measure that you didn't think of before. I am going to make a plug. I can't pull it up right now, but if you Google Vanguard Communications purple paper evaluation, I was just telling Tom about this tool that has a bunch of ideas in it on how to evaluate at every single step. So I can't pull the link up right now, but if you Google, it should come up on Google. I just did that yesterday.
Tom, you're muted.
Whoops, I'm muted. Well, anyway, so if you Google it, you can find it. I found it just in those first few seconds. So Brenda, again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, members and non-members, and we will look forward to seeing you back in January. Have a great day, everybody.